Uma's hands trembled as she cradled the newborn twins, their tiny faces, so serene, their pale white skin soft and delicate. But her joy was overshadowed by a creeping fear. She could see the shock on Chitty's face. When he stormed into the hospital room moments after the delivery, his eyes darted between the twins, and her wide with disbelief. "What is this?" Chitty bellowed, his voice echoing off the hospital walls. "Are these supposed to be my children?" Uma blinked back, tears or exhaustion from childbirth making it hard to speak. "Chitty, of course they're ours," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Look at them, they're beautiful." Chitty's expression darkened, and he took a step closer, his finger pointing accusingly at the twins. "Beautiful, Uma. These children are white, their eyes are blue. Tell me, how does a black man like me father twins who look Eno? Do you think I'm a fool?" Uma's heart sank. She hadn't noticed it immediately in the chaos of their birth, but now it was undeniable. Their features were unlike hers. "Or Chit," she reached for him, desperate to calm him down. "I don't know, Chitty. I don't know why they look this way, but they're ours. I swear to you, I've never." "Don't lie to me," Chitty roared, pulling his hand away. His voice broke, filled with anger and pain. "You betrayed me, Uma. Don't even try to deny it." The twins began to cry, their soft wails filling the room. Uma's chest tightened as she turned to soothe them. But Chitty wasn't done. "You've made a fool of me," he said, his voice cold, now almost a whisper. "You've humiliated me. I want nothing to do with you or those children." "Chitty, please," Uma pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Let's talk about this. Let's figure this out together." Chitty didn't answer. He spun on his heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound reverberated through Uma's chest, leaving her in stunned silence, her vision blurred. As she looked down at the twins, their cries subsiding as they nestled against her heel. "Come back," she whispered to herself, though the words felt hollow. He just need time. Hours passed, and Chitty did return, but not to reconcile. Uma watched in disbelief as he entered the hospital with bags in hand, tossing them carelessly at the foot of her bed. Her clothes spilled out onto the floor, a cruel display of his rage. "You and your things are no longer welcome in my house," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Pack whatever is left and go to whoever fathered those children. They're not mine." "Mine?" Uma stared at him, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. "Chitty, you can't mean this. I've been faithful to you. I don't know why the twins look this way, but I know they're yours." Chitty shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Spare me your excuses. I want a divorce. You've ruined everything." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving Uma to collapse into sobs. The nurses rushed in, their faces full of pity as they tried to console her, but Uma felt as though her world had ended. The man she loved, the man she had built a life with, had abandoned her in the moment she needed him most. As night fell and the twins slept soundly beside her, Uma stared out of the hospital window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but they offered no comfort. Her mind raced with questions. How could this have happened? What would she do now? Where would she go? She picked up her phone, her hand shaking as she dialed her mother's number. When Mama Aiken answered, Uma broke down, her sobs spilling over the line. "Ma, he's gone," Uma whispered. "Chitty has left me. He says the twins aren't his." There was silence on the other end of the line, then a firm response. "I'm coming, my child. Stay strong. I'll be there as soon as I can." Hearing her mother's voice gave Uma a sliver of hope. She wiped her tears and looked at her twins, their tiny chests rising and falling with each breath. Despite the chaos and pain, she knew one thing for certain: she would fight for them no matter what it took. But as she held her babies close, a nagging fear tugged at her heart. How would she prove their innocence when their very appearance cast out? How could she rebuild a life shattered so completely in just one day? Uma sat in the hospital room, clutching her phone long after the call with her mother had ended. The twins stirred in their bassinets, their soft murmurs breaking the silence. She glanced at the door every few minutes, half hoping Chitty would return as anger dissipated, ready to talk. But the hours passed and there was no sign of him. Only her mother's promise echoed in her mind. "I'm coming, my child." By the time Mama Ian arrived, Uma was a shell of herself. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from hours of crying. The twins were restless, their cries piercing through the quiet hospital corridors. Mama Aiken took one look at her daughter and immediately pulled her into a hug. "Hush now, Uma," she said softly, her voice steady and reassuring. "We will get through this. You are not alone." Uma broke down again, sobbing into her mother's shoulder between tears. She recounted everything that had happened, Chitty's accusations, his abandonment, and the cruel way he had left her with nothing. "Ma, he won't believe me," Uma said, her voice trembling. "He's convinced I cheated. He says the twins aren't his. But I don't understand. How could this happen? How could our children look so different? Mama Ekin pulled back, cupping Uma's face in her hands. Uma, you're not the first woman to face such trials, and you won't be the last. The truth will come out in time for. Now you need to focus on yourself and these children. They need their mother to be strong. With that, Mama Ekin sprang into action. She gathered Uma's scattered belongings, folding them neatly and packing them into the bags Chitty had dumped so callously. She arranged for the nurses to discharge Uma and ensured the twins were bundled up for the journey home back at Mama E's modest house. In Auga, Uma found herself in a familiar yet unfamiliar place. She had grown up in this home, its warm, earthy tones and simple furnishings providing a sense of comfort, but returning under such circumstances felt surreal. She sat on the old couch, watching her mother move about the house with practiced efficiency. Mama Ekin placed the steaming bowl of pepper soup in front of her. Eat, she said firmly. You've lost enough strength already. Uma shook her head. I can't, Ma. I don't even know how to think, let alone eat. My whole life is falling apart. Your life isn't falling apart, Uma, her mother said, her voice tinged with both compassion and steel. It's changing, yes, but you'll build it back. You have me. You have these beautiful children. We will find a way. The first few days were grueling. The twins cried at all hours, their needs constant and overwhelming. Uma, still weak from childbirth, struggled to keep up her mind, felt foggy, weighed down by the pain of Chitty's betrayal and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his angry face, heard his accusations echoing in her mind. But Mama Ekin was a pillar of strength. She handled the household with grace, ensuring the twins were fed, bathed, and comforted. She cooked nourishing meals for Uma, forcing her to eat even when she protested at night. She would stay awake, rocking the twins to sleep so Uma could get a few precious hours of rest. Uma, she said one evening as they sat together in the small living room, the twins finally asleep, I know it feels like the world is against you right now, but you're stronger than this. You've always been a fighter, even as a child. You won't let this break you. Uma sighed, tears welling in her eyes. I feel like I've already broken my Chitty. Was my whole world. I thought we were happy. How could he turn on me so quickly? Sometimes people show their true colors when they're tested, her mother replied. And sometimes those colors aren't what we hoped they'd be. But his actions don't define you. You will rise above this, Uma, for your children, if not for yourself. Slowly, with her mother's help, Uma began to find her footing. She learned to care for the twins on her own, their innocent smiles giving her the strength to keep going. She started eating regularly again, regaining some of the energy she had lost, but the pain of Chitty's rejection lingered, a heavy weight she couldn't shake. One afternoon, as Zuma sat on the veranda cradling one of the twins, she turned to her mother and asked, Ma, do you think I'll ever be able to prove to Chitty that I didn't betray him? Mama Yen looked at her daughter with a mix of sadness and determination. You don't need to prove anything to Chitty, she said firmly. You know your truth, Uma, and that is enough. If he can't see the blessing he's turned his back on, then that's his loss. But you, my child, will move forward, and one day you'll look back at this moment and see how far you've come. As the sun set, casting a warm golden glow over the small compound, Uma held her children close and took a deep breath. Her mother's words resonated deeply. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone, and with her mother's unwavering support, she would find a way to rebuild her life one step at a time. Days turned into weeks, and Uma gradually adjusted to her new reality. But the pain of Chitty's betrayal lingered like a wound that refused to heal. The twins, however, became her light in the darkness. Their giggles and wide, curious eyes reminded her that she had a reason to keep going even when the weight of her circumstances threatened to crush her. But just as she began to steady herself, another blow came, a devastating discovery that left her reeling. Uma had avoided looking at her bank account since the day Chitty left. Unwilling to face the financial chaos she feared he had left behind. But the day came when she had no choice. She needed to buy formula and diapers for the twins, and her dwindling cash forced her to check the joint account. Her heart sank as she opened the banking app on her phone and saw the balance, 0 Nigerian nairas. She blinked, certain she was imagining things, but the account history confirmed her worst fears. The money, every last kobo, was gone. Chitty had emptied the account the same day he had walked out of her life. Uma sat frozen, staring at the screen. That money had been her safety net, savings she had painstakingly built over the years. She had contributed far more to the account than Chitty ever had, often covering their household expenses, while he offered excuses about business ventures that never materialized. To see it wiped clean felt Like the ultimate betrayal, her anger surged, fueling her as she picked up the phone and called the bank, but it was too late. The withdrawal had been authorized by Chitty, and because the account was joint, there was nothing the bank could do. Uma felt her chest tighten. As she ended the call, she sat for a long time, the twins' soft coos in the background, doing little to soothe her. Finally, she picked up the phone again, this time dialing the police. The officers listened attentively as Uma explained the theft, their faces sympathetic, but cautious. One officer, a middle-aged man with a kind demeanor, shook his head as she finished. It's a terrible situation, madam, but tracking him down won't be easy if he's left Lagos or the state entirely. It will take time to locate him. Can't you do anything? Uma asked, desperation lacing her voice. That money was all I had to take care of my children. The officer nodded. We'll open an investigation, but I'll be honest, it might take months, even years, to recover what he stole, if we recovered at all. Uma left the police station feeling defeated, the weight of her circumstances pressing down on her shoulders. When she returned to her mother's house, Mama Aiken was waiting on the veranda, her sharp eyes immediately noticing Uma's distress. What happened, Mom? Aiken asked as Uma sat down heavily beside her. Chitty, he took all the money, Uma said, her voice cracking. Every naira. The police don't know if they'll even be able to find him. Her mother's face hardened. That man has no shame, she said, her voice trembling with anger. But don't let him destroy you, Uma. Money can be replaced. What matters now is finding a way forward. Mama Aiken words stayed with Uma as she began picking up the pieces of her life. She realized that waiting for Chitty's return or justice was futile. She needed to create her own path. She decided to look for work, knowing that relying on her mother's meager income wasn't sustainable. It wasn't easy. Uma applied for dozens of jobs, her confidence shaken. With every rejection, employers seemed hesitant to hire a young mother with no recent work experience, but she refused to give up. Finally, after weeks of searching, she was offered a position as a teaching assistant at a local primary school. The pay wasn't much, but it was a start. Uma accepted the job with gratitude, determined to make it work. Each morning, she would wake before dawn, feed the twins, and prepare them for the day. Before heading to work, her mother took care of them. While she was gone, their small house bustling with the sounds of bottles being warmed and tiny feet kicking at blankets. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Uma sat with her mother at the dining table, sipping a cup of tea. Ma, do you think I'll ever get back to the life I had before? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother looked at her, her expression a mix of compassion and determination. Uma, sometimes life doesn't take us back to where we were, takes us to a new place. You've already started rebuilding. My child, you're stronger than you think. As the twins slept soundly in the next room, Uma let her mother's words sink in. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she was beginning to see a glimmer of hope. She had survived betrayal, heartbreak, and financial ruin, and she was still standing for her children. She would keep standing no matter what came next. For 5 years, Uma had worked tirelessly to rebuild her life. With the support of her mother, she had created a safe and loving home for her children in Abuja. Dora and Shermika, now lively 5-year-olds, were her pride and joy, their laughter filling the house with warmth, but their striking pale skin and blue eyes continued to draw attention everywhere they went. At first, Uma thought nothing of the stares and hushed conversations that followed her in the marketplace or church. People were naturally curious, she told herself, but soon the curiosity turned into something darker. One afternoon, as she stood at the counter in a neighborhood shop, the shopkeeper hesitated. Before handing her the change, Uma, the woman, said, lowering her voice, people are talking. They say. Those children aren't yours, that you took them from somewhere. Is it true? Uma froze, her breath catch in her throat. What are you talking about? They're my children. The shopkeeper shrugged, avoiding her eyes. I'm just telling you what I've heard. People are wondering how a woman like you could have children like that. You should clear the air before it gets worse. Uma left the shop in a daze, her heart pounding. She had thought she'd left judgment behind when she moved to Abuja, but now it seemed her past was catching up to her in a new form. Who was spreading these rumors, and why? Over the next few weeks, Uma began noticing subtle changes in how people treated her parents. At the school where she worked grew distant, no longer engaging her in conversation. At drop-off at the market, vendors who once greeted her warmly now offered curt nods, and little else. Even her neighbors seemed to avoid her, their smiles tight and forced. The breaking point came one Sunday after church. As Uma exited the building with her mother and the twins, she overheard 2 women whispering behind her. It's not right, one of them said. She should tell the truth. A woman-like, that has no business raising children. Who clearly aren't hers. Uma turned to confront them, but they quickly walked away, their heads down. Her mother placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Let them talk, Uma mom, and said, you know the truth. And that's all that matters. But Uma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, judged, and condemned. She worried that these whispers would one day reach her children's ears, that Adora and Chima would begin to question their place in the world. She had to do something before the rumors spiraled out of control. Determined to confront the issue head-on, Uma sought advice from a close friend, Amaka, who lived in the next neighborhood. Amaka was blunt. As always, Uma, you're too quiet about all this. She said, you've let people fill in the blanks. Because you don't defend yourself, you need to tell your story before they turn it into something worse. But what can I say, Uma asked, her voice heavy with frustration, that I don't know why my children look the way they do. That even I can't explain it exactly. Amaka said, tell them the truth, you have nothing to hide. Taking Amaka advice, Uma decided to address the rumors at her workplace. First, during a staff meeting, she spoke candidly about the challenges she faced as a single mother and how her children's appearance had become a source of endless questions. I don't have all the answers, she admitted, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. But I know this, my children are mine, and I love them with everything I have. Anyone who doubts that is welcome to ask me directly instead of whispering behind my back. Her words were met with a mix of awkward silence and murmurs of agreement. Though she left the meeting feeling vulnerable, she also felt a spark of hope. By speaking her truth, she had reclaimed some of her power back in her neighborhood. The rumors didn't stop immediately, but Uma noticed a subtle shift. Some of the parents at her children's school began offering her kind words and small gestures of support. At the market, a vendor who had previously avoided her leaned over his stall one afternoon and said, Uma, don't let these people bother you. You're a good mother. Still, the journey was far from over. The rumors had left their mark, and Uma knew it would take time to rebuild her reputation. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of control over her narrative. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting back. The little house was alive with music and laughter. It was birthday time, and the twins were turning 5. Balloons hung from the ceiling, and the dining table was laden with snacks, drinks, and a beautiful cake. Uma had baked herself. The twins, dressed in matching outfits, beamed with joy as they played with their friends. Uma stood by the kitchen door watching the scene with a smile. Her mother, Mama Aiken, was busy handing out plates of jollof rice to the children, while Amaka, Uma's closest friend, chatted with a few of the guests. For the first time in years, Uma allowed herself to feel at peace. But just as the party reached its peak, a knock at the door broke the cheerful rhythm. I'll get it, Uma said. Excusing herself, she opened the door to find no one there. Instead, a small, intricately wrapped box sat on the doorstep. Uma frowned, glancing around the street. But there was no sign of the delivery person. Her curiosity quickly turned to unease as she picked up the box and noticed it bore no name, no return address. Nothing returning to the living room she called for. Her mother, Ma, did anyone mention bringing a gift for the twins? She asked, holding up the box. Mama Aiken shook her head. No. Who's it from? I don't know, Umar replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. The guests gathered around as Uma carefully unwrapped the package. Inside, she found a single white card and a folded piece of black paper. She opened the black paper, first her hands trembling slightly. Her breath caught as she read the chilling words scrawled in bold, uneven handwriting, your happiness is borrowed. Uma, watch your back. This isn't over. The room fell silent as the note passed from hand to hand, the joyful atmosphere replaced by a heavy sense of unease. Uma picked up the white card and found a photograph inside, a candid shot of her and the twins at a park. She felt her heart race. Someone had been watching them. Part 2 of the story will continue shortly. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to stay updated. This journey is just getting started. The air was thick with unease as the guests dispersed, their murmurs barely audible over Uma's pounding heartbeat. She clutched the photograph tightly, her hands trembling. The image of her and the twins, taken without her knowledge, sent shivers down her spine. The black paper lay discarded on the table, its chilling words etched in her mind, your happiness is borrowed. Uma, watch your back. This isn't over. Mama Aiken stood beside her, her face a mask of worry. Uma, you can't ignore this. Someone is clearly trying to unsettle you. But Uma whispered, her voice barely audible. Why would anyone go to such lengths? Her mother frowned, her sharp gaze darting toward the photograph. You need to involve the police. Uma hesitated, her mind racing. The thought of reliving her past, of dragging the twins to the spotlight again, made her stomach churn. The house was quiet now, save for the twins' soft breathing from their room. Amaka had stayed after the party to help clean up her sharp words, offering a mix of comfort and practicality. Uma, whoever sent this note, is trying to scare you, Amaka had said, her eyes narrowing as she studied the threatening message. Don't let them when you're stronger than this. Before leaving, Amaka had hugged Uma tightly at the door. I'll call you when I get to Port Harcourt. My sister needs me right now. But you call me if anything else happens, okay? Her absence, though understandable, made Uma feel more vulnerable as Mama Ayn cleared the table. Uma sat staring at the photograph. In note, her thoughts tangled in fear and confusion. The next morning, Uma sat in the small, stuffy office of the local police station, the note and photograph laid out on the desk in front of her. The officer in charge, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, glanced at the items before leaning back in his chair. It's unsettling, I won't lie, he said, but threats like these are hard to trace, especially without a clear suspect. But what about the photograph? Uma pressed. Someone is watching us. Doesn't that mean something? The officer sighed. It could be a prank or someone trying to scare you for some reason. We'll log this and keep an eye out, but I'd advise you to stay alert and let us know if anything else happens. Uma left the station feeling both frustrated and vulnerable. The police didn't seem to grasp the gravity of the situation, and now the onus was on her to protect her family. The following day, Uma tried to resume her routine, but the weight of the threat hung over her like a storm cloud. At the school where she worked, she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to find someone lurking in the shadows. By midday, her anxiety reached a breaking point. Returning to her desk after a lesson, she froze. There, lying neatly in the middle of her desk, was another envelope. The handwriting was identical to the first. Note bold and uneven, her hands shook as she opened it, the room spinning slightly. As she read, you can't escape the truth, Uma. The world will see you for who you really are. Her breath hitched. This wasn't just about her. Whoever was doing this wanted to ruin her completely. Her vision blurred as tears threatened to spill, and she barely noticed the bell signaling the end of the day. Grabbing her bag, she rushed out of the school. As she stepped outside, lost in thought and fear, a car horn blared loudly. Uma stopped in her tracks, realizing she had almost stepped into the street. Without looking, a hand grabbed her arm, pulling her back. Just in time, car. Careful, a voice said, concerned but firm. Uma looked up to see a tall man with warm brown skin and a neatly trimmed beard. He looked vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place him. Are you all right? He asked, his hand still steadying her. The man bent down and picked something up. You dropped this, he said, holding out the note. She had been clutching his eyes flickered with curiosity, but not prying judgment. Uma snatched it quickly, her heart pound, sounding, I'm fine, thank you. I wasn't paying attention. He hesitated, as if weighing his next words. I think I recognize you. You live in the complex on Rosewood Street, right? Uma blinked, her mind catching up now that she looked at him more closely. She realized he seemed vaguely familiar. Yes, I do. He offered a small smile. I moved in last week. I'm Ken, your next-door neighbor. Uma's shoulders saged in a mix of relief and weariness. He was her neighbor, not a stranger. Still, she was too shaken to fully relax. I'm Uma. Ken glanced at her again, his brow furrowed. You seem a little upset. Can I walk you home? You don't look like you should be out here alone. Uma hesitated, letting someone into her space. Even if it was just walking her to her apartment, felt risky. But she was shaken, and the thought of someone close by made her feel a little safer. All right, she said quietly. Thank you. They walked home quietly. The evening air cool and still. Ken stayed a short distance behind Uma, giving her space while making sure she felt safe. Uma clutched her bag tightly, the note hidden inside, her heart racing with fear and questions she couldn't answer. When they reached her door, Uma turned slightly and said, thank you. Her voice was soft but sincere. Ken nodded. Anytime, he replied before stepping back to his apartment. Uma stepped inside her home and shut the door the moment her mother, Mama Aiken, saw her face. She hurried over. Uma, what's wrong? What happened? She asked, her voice full of worry. Uma's hands shook as she set her bag on the table. It happened again, Ma, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Another note. 2 days later, Ken was leaving his apartment for a morning run when his eyes caught an envelope lying near the base of his door. He bent to pick it up, frowning. As he examined it, there was no address, no sender, just a folded sheet of paper inside. Curiosity piqued. He opened it. His heart sank. It was the same handwriting as the note he had seen. Uma had dropped. Without a second thought, he knocked on her door. Uma opened it cautiously, her mother hovering just behind her. Seeing Ken, she relaxed slightly. Ken, is everything all right? I'm sorry to bother you, he said, holding up the envelope, but I think this is meant for you. It was outside my door. Uma's face drained of color. Her mother stepped forward, her eyes narrowing at the envelope. What's this, Uma? Mama Aiken demanded. It's nothing. Uma tried to deflect her voice Faltering, it's clearly something her mother pressed, snatching the envelope. She opened it before Uma could protest the note. Inside read, "You're not the mother they need. They'll be better off without you." Uma's knees buckled, and Mama Ayn caught her, helping her to the couch. Ken stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure if he should leave or stay. "Uma, you can't keep this to yourself," her mother said firmly. "This is serious, Ias." Ken cleared his throat. "I don't want to intrude, but if you're dealing with threats, I might be able to help. I work in security." Uma looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear and doubt. "Why would you help me?" Ken shrugged. "Because I'm your neighbor, and no one should have to go through something like this alone." Mama Ayn nodded approvingly. "He's right, Uma. Let him help. You need someone who knows what they're doing." Uma hesitated, but finally nodded. "All right, thank you." Ken offered a reassuring smile. "We'll figure this out together." Uma sat across from Ken in her small living room, the dim evening light casting soft shadows across their faces. Mama Eakin had just left the room to check on the twins, leaving Uma and Ken to delve deeper into the strange and terrifying situation. She found herself in. "Uma," Ken began, his tone gentle but firm, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Uma hesitated. "What is it? These notes, they feel personal. Do you have any idea who might want to harm you? Anyone from your past who might hold a grudge?" Uma's shoulders sagged. After a long pause, she began to speak. "Chitty," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My ex-husband, he abandoned me when the twins were born, accused me of cheating because of how they look." Ken listened intently, nodding for her to continue. "I tried to explain. I begged him to believe me, but he refused. He took everything, our savings, our home, and left me with nothing." "What about his parent, his family?" Ken asked quietly. Uma hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Chitty, he never really talked about his past. All know is that he grew up in an orphanage. He said his parents were gone, and that was that. I never pressed him on it because he didn't seem to want to talk about it." Ken nodded slowly. "Sometimes people keep their past buried for a reason. It doesn't mean you're responsible, but it could be connected. I'll look into it discreetly." The next day, Uma went to work, her nerves still raw. She tried to focus on her lessons, but every small noise or unexpected movement set her on edge. By the time she returned home, she felt drained. She was just unlocking her door when she noticed a European Caucasian woman standing a few feet away, her gaze steady but not unkind. The woman was striking with a composed demeanor and sharp, pale features that looked just like her twins. Uma's instincts kicked in, her hand tightening on her bag. "Can I help you?" Uma asked cautiously. The woman stepped forward, her movements deliberate but not threatening. "Hello, Uma. My name is Amelie Dupont. I've been wanting to speak with you." Uma frowned. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" Amal shook her head. "No, but I know your husband, or rather your ex-husband." Chitty. Hearing Chitty's name felt like a slap to Uma's already fragile nerves. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice firm but wary. Amelie hesitated, her expression softening. "There are things about Chitty's past that you don't know, things he didn't tell you, and I think it's time you knew." Inside the apartment, Amelie revealed a story that left Uma reeling. Chitty's mother, a young Nigerian woman, was abandoned by Chitty's European father shortly after Chitty was born. Chitty's mother died when Chitty was just 6 years old, leaving him to grow up in an orphanage plagued by resentment and abandonment. Amelie, as it turned out, was Chitty's half-sister, the child of the same father who had abandoned Chitty. She had only recently discovered Chitty's existence and had been trying to find him ever since Amal's father, just before he died, made her promise to find him. "I hired Ken to keep an eye on you," Amelie admitted, her tone unapologetic. "Not because I wanted to invade your privacy, but because I wanted to find Chitty. I thought if I was close to you and the twins, I'd have a way to reach him." Uma's head spun as the pieces began to fall into place. "You think Chitty is the one behind all of this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amelie nodded grimly. "The notes, the threats, they all have his fingerprints on them." Chitty's unresolved pain and hatred run deep. Seeing his children pale-skinned with blue eyes would have been a constant reminder of his father's betrayal. "I visited the orphanage where he grew up and learned a lot about him." Uma's gaze shifted to Ken, who had entered the room just before Amelie began speaking. Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and hurt as she asked, "So you lied to me? Why didn't you just tell me the truth from the beginning?" Ken looked genuinely remorseful. "I'm sorry, Uma. I was acting on Amal's instructions. She wasn't sure how you would react, especially after everything Chitty put you through. That's right," Amelie added softly. "I didn't know if you'd even want to hear from me after the pain Chitty caused you. I thought this was the best way to help without overwhelming you." Uma's hands clenched into fists as she tried to process the deluge of revelations. "This is a lot to take," and she said, her voice cracking. She looked down, shaking her head. For years, I've endured so much, not knowing why my children are the way they are, and now finding out that Chitty knew all. Along she paused, swallowing hard. It's unbearable. Amal took a step closer, her tone filled with regret. I know it doesn't erase what you've been through, but I want to help. I want to make this right for you, for the twins, and for Chitty, if he'll let me. Ken spoke gently, his voice steady. Uma, I understand if you're upset with me, but we're here now. And we're not leaving you to face this alone. Let us help you figure this out. Uma's eyes darted between them, her chest heaving with the weight of it all. She wanted to lash out, to scream at them for their deception, but a part of her also longed to let go of the burden she'd carried for so long. For a brief moment, silence filled the room, heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Uma drew a shaky breath and whispered, I need time. Ken nodded. Take all the time you need. I'll be right next door if you need me. Amelie gave a small nod of understanding. I'll respect your space, Uma, but please know I only want to help. As they left the room, Uma sank into the nearest chair, her head in her hands. The revelations churned in her mind, each one heavier than the last. For years, she had faced her struggles alone, but now with these unexpected allies, she wasn't sure what scared her more, the truth or the unknown that lay ahead. The days that followed were fraught with tension. Uma found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, her nerves on edge. Though she appreciated Ken and Amal's support, she struggled with a lingering sense of betrayal. Trust didn't come easily after years of abandonment and whispers behind her back. Ken, true to his word, continued his investigation. Quietly, he spent hours tracking down leads and piecing together the fragments of Chitty's life. Meanwhile, Amal focused on trying to connect with Uma, her genuine regret for her brother's actions evident in every gesture. One afternoon, Ken knocked on Uma's door. His expression was grave, a folder tucked under his arm. I found something, he said, stepping inside. Uma gestured for him to sit, while Mama took the twins into the next room. Sensing the weight of the moment, Ken opened the folder, revealing photos and documents. I traced Chitty's movements over the past few months. He's been in Abuja. Uma, he's closer than we thought. Uma's heart sank. Abuja. How long? Ken hesitated. A few months. Long enough to know where you live, long enough to orchestrate these threats. Uma clenched her fist. Hyun's been watching us. Why? What does he want? Ken's gaze softened. I think it's more than revenge. He's consumed by his hatred for his father, for himself. The twins are a trigger for all of it. But this isn't just about you. Uma is about his unresolved trauma. He's lashing out because he doesn't know how to deal with it. Amelie, who had joined him, quietly spoke up. I think he's trying to force you into breaking, to confirm his own twisted narrative that you betrayed him. 2 days later, the unthinkable happened. Uma was at work when she received a frantic call from Mama Aiken. Uma, the twins, they're gone, her mother cried, her voice trembling with fear. What do you mean gone? Uma's knees buckled as the words sank, and I only stepped out for a moment. When I came back, the door was open, and they were gone. Mama Ayn sobbed. Uma's vision blurred as panic took over. She barely remembered calling Ken or how she got back home. When she arrived, Ken and Amelie were already there, their faces grim. Chitty, Ken said, his voice low, but certain this has to be him. Uma's phone buzzed with a message. It was a video. Her breath hitched as she pressed play. The twins were sitting in a dimly lit room, their eyes wide with fear. A voice she recognized too well spoke over the footage. If you want to see them again, Uma, you'll do exactly as I say. Tell the world the truth, that they're not mine, then you'll have them back. The video ended, leaving Uma in a state of shock. Amelie clenched her fist, her face pale. We need to act fast. He's losing control. This could turn dangerous. Ken's jaw tightened. I'll track the location, Uma. Stay here with Amelie. I'll handle this. Uma shook her head vehemently. No, they're my children. I'm coming with you. Ken hesitated, then nodded. All right. But you have to trust me. We'll get them back. As the hours ticked by, Ken worked tirelessly, using his security expertise to trace the origin of the video. Amelie pulled every string she could, calling in favors to gather resources for their search. We need to be careful, Ken warned. As they finalized their plan, Chitty's unstable. If he feels cornered, he might do something drastic. Uma nodded, her fear eclipsed by determination. Whatever it takes, I'll do anything to get my children back. Ken leaned over the cluttered desk in his dimly lit apartment, sifting through a trail of breadcrumbs that had finally led him to Chitty. The clues were subtle but clear. A series of online purchases under an alias, deliveries to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, and a cryptic message left in one of the notes, phrases that Ken recognized as code used in underground circles. Chitty's methods were clever but not flawless. Ken's expertise in security and surveillance allowed him to piece together the fragments, painting a picture of a man driven by desperation and unresolved trauma. The final breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a street vendor near the warehouse. Ken had shown the vendor a photo of Chitty and asked if he'd seen him. The vendor nodded, his face darkening. "He comes around here, sometimes real jittery. Last I saw, he was heading toward that old warehouse by the river." Ken immediately called Amelie, who insisted on accompanying him to confront Chitty. Together they informed and prepared for what was to come. The abandoned warehouse loomed in the distance, its broken windows and rusted exterior casting ominous shadows. In the moonlight, Uma clutched her phone tightly, her pulse racing as she stepped out of the car with Ken and Amelie. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, but the thought of her twins Adora and Chima kept her rooted in determination. Ken handed Uma a small earpiece. "Stay close to me, let me handle the confrontation," he said, his voice calm but firm. Nodded, her jaw clenched. "I'll do whatever it takes to get my children back." Amelie lingered behind, her expression unreadable. "Be careful, Chitty is unpredictable." The abandoned warehouse stood in eerie silence, its walls cracked and shadowed by years of neglect. Uma's heart pounded as she stepped inside, her breath catching at the sight of her twins huddled together on the cold floor. Chitty stood nearby, pacing back and forth, his figure outlined by the dim glow of a single hanging bulb. "Chitty," Uma called out, her voice trembling but firm. "Let them go. They're just children, your children." Chitty stopped pacing and turned to face her. His face was gone, his eyes wide with shock, hollow with anger and pain. He pointed a shaking finger at her. "They're not my children," he spat. "Every time I look at them, I see him, the man who destroyed my mother, who left her to die. How can you expect me to love something that reminds me of my greatest pain?" Uma's knees felt weak, but she stood her ground, her gaze locked on Chit's. "They're not him, Chitty. They're not your father. They're your children, innocent and undeserving of your hate." Chitty let out a bitter laugh. "You don't understand, Uma. You never will. I grew up in an orphanage, surrounded by the whispers of pity and judgment. Every day, I saw boys with fathers who cared, mothers who loved them. But me, I had nothing, no one." He stepped closer, his voice rising. "And now these children, they curse, a reminder of everything I tried to bury. Do you know what that feels like?" Uma's voice cracked as she took a step forward. "Yes, Chitty, I know what it feels like to carry pain, to be judged unfair, to be abandoned. But you can't let that pain define you. You can't punish them for something they didn't do." The twins whimpered softly, their frightened eyes darting between their parents. Uma crouched down, extending her arms toward them. "They're your chance to be better, Chitty, to break this cycle of hatred and become the father you never had." Chitty faltered, his hand dropping to his side as his shoulders slumped. Tears glistened in his eyes as he stared at the twins. "I can't," he whispered, shaking his head. "I can't love them. I can't love what reminds me of him." Uma's voice softened, her own tears streaming down her face. "Then let them go, Chitty. If you can't love them, don't hurt them. They deserve a chance to grow, to be happy, to be loved." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Chitty's breath hitched as he glanced at the twins one last time, his expression a mixture of anguish and resignation. Slowly, he stepped back, raising his hands in surrender. "Take them," he said, "Helly, just take them and go." Uma rushed to her children, pulling them into her arms as their cries of relief filled the air. Ken and Amelie, who had been waiting nearby, stepped forward cautiously. Ken kept his gaze on Chitty, ensuring he didn't make any sudden move. "Thank you," Uma whispered, holding the twins tightly. "Thank you for letting them go." But Chitty wasn't listening. He turned away, his movements sluggish, as though his strength had drained from him. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Without another word, he fled the scene, disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. Ken immediately alerted the police, who arrived within minutes. Uma held the twins close as officers combed the area, eventually apprehending Chitty in the alley behind the building. He didn't resist as they placed him in handcuffs, his eyes vacant and hollow. As the officers led him away, Amelie approached him cautiously. "Chitty," she said softly, her voice trembling, "this doesn't have to be the end. You can still heal. You can still find peace." Chitty glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but not today." The days following the confrontation brought a cautious sense of calm to Uma's home. The twins began to reclaim their innocence, their laughter gradually returning as Uma and Mama Ikin enveloped them in warmth and love. Amelie, ever present and quietly supportive worked tirelessly to ensure their safety and well-being one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Amelie approached Uma. They stood on the veranda, the hum of crickets providing a soothing backdrop. Uma Mal began, her tone gentle but earnest. I've been thinking I can help you relocate. A fresh start somewhere far from here might be what you need. There a chance to leave the past behind. Uma turned to look at her twins, playing with Mama Icon inside, their laughter filling the air. A tender smile touched her lips, but her expression remained resolute. I appreciate the offer, Amelie, truly, she said, but this is my home. My roots are here. The twins are just starting to feel safe again. Their school, their friends, this is their world. Uprooting them now would only add to the chaos. Maybe someday, when they're older, I'll reconsider. But for now, I need to rebuild here, where we belong. Amal's eyes softened, and she reached out to touch Uma's hand. You're an incredible woman, Uma, stronger than you give yourself credit for. If you ever change your mind, I'll be here. Uma nodded, gratitude shining through her eyes. Thank you, Amelie, for everything you've done, more than I could have ever asked for. Amal hesitated, her voice softer. Now, there's one more thing, Uma. I'd like to be a part of their lives, if you don't mind. Uma's bread caught for a moment, her gaze flickering back to the twins. After a thoughtful pause, she smiled warmly. I think they'd like that, and I would too. Later that night, as the house fell into a peaceful hush, Uma sat on the veranda, lost in thought. Ken joined her, handing her a mug of tea. They're lucky to have you, he said, glancing at the twins' room. Uma smiled faintly. Most days, I think I'm the lucky one. Ken looked at her, his tone steady. You're not alone, Uma. You never have to be. Uma met his gaze, her voice soft but sincere. Thank you, Ken, for everything. The quiet connection between them spoke volumes, a promise of support and understanding. As dawn broke, Uma stood at the window watching sunlight spill across the neighborhood behind her. Mama Ekin and the twins filled the house with warmth and chatter. Taking a deep breath, Uma felt ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was truly living. This video is dedicated to everyone who has suffered a similar plight as Uma. In particular, we dedicated it to the cousin of one of our subscribers from Jamaica and a loving mother whose life was tragically cut short by her husband after she gave birth to white babies. Believing she had been unfaithful, he took her life, only to later discover that the children were indeed as. Overcome with guilt, he descended into madness and requested to be buried beside her. In story is a heartbreaking reminder of the importance of love, trust, and understanding in relationships. Part 3 of the story will continue shortly. Tell us what touched you the most in Uma's story. Do you think she should have taken the offer to relocate and keep running? Is she truly safe even now? Let's talk about it in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, what are you waiting for? Click subscribe right away for more amazing stories like this. The fluorescent lights buzz faintly in the dim cell block, their cold glow reflecting off the cracked cement walls. Chitty sat hunched on the edge of his S's, hands clasped tightly.